That was Subterranean Homesick Blues. And fellas, if you were listening closely enough, you can hear the sounds of Bob Dylan inventing rap in that song, because that's exactly what's going on there.
Is that a Pitchfork article? Like, I feel like that's a Pitchfork article that happened that no one else believes in outside of that or Onion AV Club, you know?
No, that was
how Bob Dylan actually created hip hop. You know, like I feel, yeah,
invented rap. All right, so this is the number 23 album in of the 1960s from the Best Ever Albums list of the best albums of the 60s, and it's number 4 in 1965, and almost cracks the top 100, coming in at 102 overall. So not just in the 60s, but of all time. So. We're getting into that realm now. It's Dylan's 5th studio album, and it's also the 5th album that we are covering on Combing the Stacks from Bob Dylan. And this album was pretty much recorded over 2 days, from January 14th through January 15th, 1965. But there's a slight, technically part of the recording was also on the 13th, and that's the very intro of the song Bob Dylan's 115th Dream. That's the song where he he starts singing and then he breaks and they start laughing in the studio. That little clip right there was the only thing on this album that was recorded on the 13th, and everything else was on the other 2 days. And the album was released on March 22nd, 1965. So this album is, as John mentioned earlier, this is where Dylan starts to go in his electric phase. The first side of the album is pretty much all electric, rock-based music with a band, multi-instruments, drums, bass, electric music. And the second side is the acoustic part, mostly just Dylan and his guitar. There's some other small instrumentation going on as well, but for the most part, it's just Dylan doing his acoustic thing. So while you have two different sounds, the lyrical content is also notable on this record, because this is where he really officially starts ditching the topical lyrics and the protest type songs that he was doing, that he became famous for in the folk scene, and he ditched those for more surreal topics, done more in kind of a stream of consciousness fashion. There's certainly a departure from his previous types of lyrics and where he goes with this record, and it's foreshadows where he goes after this as well for the next couple of albums. It was a pretty successful record for Dylan, and it reached number 6 in the U.S. charts, and it makes that his first album that he was able to crack the top 10. So a couple of things happened leading up to this record. In 1964, the summer of 1964 is when he meets the Beatles, and we had talked about that before, and where he really influenced the Beatles in terms of challenging them to say a little bit more of their lyrics. That he would cite the Beatles as challenging him to do a little bit more musically. Tom Wilson was the producer of this record, CTS famous producer Tom Wilson. He's actually the person laughing at that beginning of that part of Bob Dylan's 115th Dream, which I guess I always thought, I wasn't sure who that was. I always thought it was Dylan, but it's Tom Wilson. And another influence for Dylan in this record was a guy by the name of John P. Hammond, who was the son of John H. Hammond. And not sure if you guys remember him, but he was the one that actually signed Dylan to his first record deal several years earlier. And John P. Hammond, so John Hammond Jr., was actually a folk artist who did start recording electric blues rock. And he had an album earlier in 1965 called So Many Roads, which is cited as being a fairly influential album, not just to Dylan, but to the electric blues, electric rock realm, I guess you could say. And the other thing that's interesting about that record is John Hammond recorded with a couple of members of the band, including Robbie Robertson, Levon Helm, and Garth Hudson. So they were the musicians on that record, and that's also, I think that's one of the ways that Dylan heard about them and later would invite them to be his backing band on his famous tour in 1965 and 1966. So a couple of notes, a couple of quotes from some of the people that were there. The guitarist Bruce Langhorne, for the recording, said that he noticed that there was no rehearsal. We just did first takes, and I remember that for what it was. It was amazingly intuitive and successful. Few takes were required of each song, and after 3.5 hours of recording, lasting from about 2:30 p.m. to 6 o'clock p.m. There were master takes of Love Minus Zero, No Limit, Subterranean Homesick Blues, Outlaw Blues, She Belongs to Me, and Bob Dylan's 115th Dream. They were all recorded in that session, right, in over a couple of hours. Photographer Daniel Kramer recalls that the musicians were enthusiastic. They conferred with one another to work out the problems as they arose. Dylan bounced around from one man to another, explaining what he wanted, often showing them on the piano what was needed, until like a giant puzzle, the pieces would fit and the picture emerged whole. Most of the songs went down easily and needed only 3 or 4 takes. In some cases, the first take sounded completely different from the final one because the material was played at a different tempo, perhaps, or a different chord was. And finally, a couple other things. The album cover that you might have noticed features in the background the woman that's sitting behind Dylan is actually Sally Grossman, who was the wife of manager Albert Grossman, which I found kind of surprising. If you've ever seen a picture of Albert Grossman, I'm sure that the money that he brought in was something that attracted her to him, because
he was not a looker. Is that what you're saying?
He wasn't much.
She was a looker.
She was more of a looker than he was.
Does he live up to his name? Is he gross, man?
Yes, and I think that's not just in his appearance; it's probably in his personal demeanor as well. Interesting, on the album cover, Dylan is sitting I don't know if he's on a couch or whatever, but there's several records that are strewn about him, including Robert Johnson's King of the Delta Blues. You can see that in the album cover, as well as his previous album, Another Side of Bob Dylan. And Dylan is also holding his cat in this record photo, and the cat's name is Rolling Stone. Dylan had a cat named Rolling Stone. And also, the photo was nominated for a Grammy for Cover of the Year. And I didn't even know that the Grammys had a category for album cover of the year, so I guess that makes sense. I just never thought of that.
Do they still have it, though? Maybe they got rid of that category.
They might have, but yeah, I don't know. But this was nominated but did not win. And then I saw a quote from John Hughes in 1986. Film director John Hughes cited it as so influential on him as an artist that upon its release, when Hughes was still in his teens, he said, "Thursday I was one person, and Friday I was another." So, Bob Dylan, bringing it all back home.
Can I do a quick clean real quick, just because I was curious about this?
Did I screw up?
No, there is a best cover, but it's called Best Recording Package these days, and it was changed to Best Album Package, and it started in 1959, and believe it or not, I think it still exists to this day. And the winner, if you're wondering, for 2020 was Chris Cornell. And it was apparently taken by Barry Ahmet, Joe Spix, and Jeff Ahmet of Pearl Jam. So there you go. That was the last winner. Other notable winners recently were Mass Seduction by St. Vincent, Black Star by David Bowie, and Lightning Bolt by Pearl Jam.
Wasn't Black Star by David Bowie just a star?
I feel like I could win this
stylized star.
I'm going to work on my EGOT here.
Nice. Sorry to interrupt there.
No, that's fine. It was interesting. So let's talk reactions here. Let's start with Josh. This is a different Dylan. First of all, Josh, were you familiar with this record leading into this week?
No, I wasn't. In fact, I'm starting, because we're covering so many Dylan albums, I'm starting to get confused about the chronology of things, because where it falls in line with some of the other albums we talked about. And it looks like we don't even discuss the album that was right before this, but after times they are changing. So I'll have to go
so
back
he
and
did
listen
his
to that,
self-titled album, then we did the Freewheelin, then it was Times Are Changin', which we covered, and then he did Another Side of Bob Dylan, which we just missed. If I'm not mistaken, that's like 102 or 103 right now in Best Ever Albums of the 60s. And then this album came out. This is number 5.
Gotcha. So that being said, I do really like the switch to electric. It sounds completely pleasing and refreshing to me to hear this. It's so much more upbeat and fast tempo. I think I really like the electric version of Bob Dylan more than the folk version. And he wasn't really the quote unquote folk version of Bob Dylan for that long. It was really only 4 albums or so before he switched to this electric side, but I guess, it was shocking to people. But yeah, I really like the up-tempo nature of this, the more like country, almost there's some country inflection in this, I think, and there's just some more like honky tonk rock and roll feeling of this on the, like you said, at least on the first half of the album. Subterranean Homesick Blues, probably one of my favorite songs off this album. And thanks for explaining the outtake too from his dream. That's a perfect example of what you said about his stream of consciousness. That's basically a whole song of him describing a crazy dream, which was entertaining. But the backside is also very good. I really like It's Alright Baby Blue. I think that's my second favorite song off of the album, which is the final song on the album. You still get the essence of Dylan on this album, right? Even though he's going electric, it's still about the lyrics and the imagery and the feeling that he's able to conjure through his music and, coupled with the lyrics. But there's just something about it being so much more energy that he brings to it that I respond to a lot more. And I'm expecting, going forward, because we still have to talk about Highway 61 Revisited and Blonde on Blonde, which are all both coming up and are after this. And I'm excited to listen to those to get that feeling more. So yeah, this is a big thumbs up for me. I think this is it's probably my favorite Bob Dylan album that we've listened to so far. Even though it just coincidentally falls on the in line with how they're ranked, but I like this one the most.
Do you think that would you say that the way that they've been presented so far is the way that you might rank them anyway, or?
No, I'd have to go back and listen to them. I did like John Wesley Harding, if I recall. I think what I'm going to have to do is, after we're done, go back and listen to them in order and see how kind of that progression goes to get the full
in chronological
effect.
Order, you mean? Or the order? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, in release order, to see that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of weird doing, so I would say that it's kind of weird doing some of these albums in reverse order, like, it's not just chronology of the story, but also of just the sound. It's kind of it's a little difficult to get the full feeling of what was going on.
Right.
But yeah. All right, yeah. John, what about you?
Well, to go off of the idea of what Josh said, this is not my favorite Dylan album we've done so far. That would be Nashville Skyline for me, was probably my favorite. Of the albums we've done, though, so far, this is probably my second favorite. This is a really interesting listen, both because of what you guys mentioned, because we were late Dylan, and then we were early Dylan, and now we're middle Dylan, right? So you're kind of all over. It's also an interesting listen because I'm very well aware of what's coming after this, that combination of Highway 61 Revisited and Blonde on Blonde. And in that context, this is an interesting listen because this is definitely, it feels like to me like he's dipping his toe into doing electric. It's not as definitively Dylan going electric as I always think of in my head. I think that what I realized in listening to this was it is much less aggressive and much less rockish, I think, than the other two albums. But having just listened to, the Freewheelin Bob Dylan, right, you can definitely see how it's a different entity altogether. It's fascinating when you look at it from a distance to see how much vitriol this brought on, because it doesn't seem like a whole scale change to me, as opposed to Josh and Matt, as if like he released like Highway 61 Revisited as his next album. You know what I mean? It's and I'll save some of that for the next time, but it definitely, he eases into what this is going to sound like. This still sounds very much like a folk album to me in many ways, just with, a couple more bass lines and, an electric guitar, albeit not a wailing, blaring electric guitar.
Right.
I think the songs on this album are my favorite songs we've done so far. It's Dylan straddling that line of writing poignant lyrics, but not becoming like a cartoonish version of himself. I've always connected best with Dylan's songs during this era, the electric era, that mid-60s era. Later Dylan became a little bit more of like a what I sometimes criticize Bruce Springsteen for, just like a series of character sketches that don't always have a lot of heart to me. They kind of just churn out one after another. That was my only real knock on Nashville Skyline when we covered that. And folk music tends to not have enough variety for me at times. This does a nice job of straddling having enough variety but also quality of songs. I do like the first half of this album a lot more than the second half of this album. I think unless we're talking about like a Rolling Stone, you know, I think like once Bob Dylan goes to about 5.5 minutes, I always find myself saying, I don't know if I need any more.
I was just going to say that.
he's a much better songwriter in 3, 4, and 5 minute increments than he is at 5.5, 6, 7, 8 minute increments. And it feels sometimes like he's stacking the same kind of idea on top of each other. And I don't know, you know, I don't think like adding in a guitar solo or anything like that in, or a jam out would be any different necessarily. So that's my only criticism of the back end of the album, is I think some of the songs run a little bit too long. With that being said, not the entire back end of the album, because Josh mentioned it, and it's probably my favorite song on this entire album. You know, the last track of the album, It's All Over Now, Baby Blue, is a great song. And it falls into what I was talking about, because after a string of 4 songs, I believe, that were 5.5 minutes plus, it chokes in at 4 minutes and 12 seconds and kind of ties back in again. But there's a lot of songs that you'll recognize: Subterranean Homesick Blues, Maggie's Farm, which I feel has been covered about 7,000 times. I always think of like the Rage Against the Machine cover of it because it's so different. Mr. Tambourine Man, obviously, which had another life of its own from the Byrds. So there's all kinds of stuff you'll recognize on this album. So I like this album. I like other Dylan better than this album, though, and I think that's where I'm trying to give it its due without comparing and contrasting it to other albums. But we're covering so much Dylan, it's almost unavoidable. I didn't really cover the instrumentation, though, and so Matt, I'm going to kind of kick it over to you to let you have your thoughts, and maybe I'll revisit that.
Well, I just have a quick question, because I want to clarify. So did you say that Nashville Skyline's your favorite, but then you said your favorite songs that we've done so far for Dylan are on this record? So what does that mean exactly? The
songwriting, the lyrics.
Okay, gotcha.
Not the entire. Why Nashville Skyline is superior to me is because the way it sounds, I like a lot better.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah.
So I love this album, and it's easily my favorite Dylan album that we've done so far. This might be my favorite Dylan album, period. And I am going to have to. It's been a while since I've listened a lot to Blonde on Blonde and Highway 61. And so I'm looking forward to delving into those more. But I would say first and foremost, I would say you're probably right, John, and this is not as rocking maybe as he does get later on. But it's definitely rocking, and it's definitely different than what he was doing before. And I think it certainly scratches that itch. And then the second side of the album, you're getting the folk. So you're getting this album, more so than any other Dylan album in the 60s, is really scratching both of those itches. You're getting, and all the songs are great. There's no duds on here. And you've just got classic stuff. I think Subterranean Homesick Blues, I mentioned last week how Overture might be one of my favorite opening tracks of any record. I think Subterranean Homesick Blues might be up there as well. That's just what a great song that is, and just the way that opens. The other thing that's good about that song is if you ever see the video clip of it's Dylan like standing and he's holding all the cue cards and it's got the lyrics on him. Yeah. And that's been parodied. In Excess did, I think it was Meditate was the song, and they were like, there's a lot of parodying of that. And that's the other interesting thing as I researched this album, John, you're talking about other covers and stuff, but it's just, there are so many different bands and artists that stole from this in some way, shape, or form, either doing a cover or doing an homage to like a video clip or something like that. Playing on words, things like that, different lines of songs incorporating into their songs and titles. This is Dylan's. It's really, when you read like the amount of people that it influenced you, it becomes overwhelming. You're just like, yeah, fine. It's everybody's on there. But I also think it's important to note that when Dylan went in this direction and his folk fans were really, getting upset by it and booing him off stage and all the stuff that would happen in his subsequent tours, it wasn't just that he was going rock. I mean, one of the things that they felt betrayed about was the lyrical content, right? Which is like, what are you talking about, right? This is a vast departure lyrically from the stuff that he was doing in the protest
like
stuff.
more political.
Yeah, I mean, the other stuff,
yeah.
I mean, when you're talking about Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll and Times Are A-Changin' and Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, I mean, this is like poignant stuff that all the, the Bohemians and everybody's just sitting in the audience just like, wow, man, he's so deep and saying, and then he comes through and he's like, Bob Dylan's 115th Dream, talking about like discovering America and all these crazy antics that happen. It's like, what are you talking about, And they felt betrayed, And Joan Baez at this time was trying to, they had an on again, off again relationship, and he toured with her. They toured together, and she really wanted him to be part of the movement, and was like, come to this protest, come to this, walkout or whatever. And he was like, I don't want to do that. I want to do music, and so. That's the other thing that I found in researching this is a lot of people are like speculating as to like who he's talking about or what he's talking about. And there's all these, everybody's got their own theory, right? But nobody knows for sure. But one of the themes that people take from this is like Dylan, stepping away. I'm not going to work on Maggie's Farm no more. I'm not going to go be part of that folk movement. They want me to be somebody else. I'm going to be me and do my own thing, is one of the themes that they have here. So that's another reason. It's not so much that how rocking it got, although that certainly was a part of it, but it was also the lyrical content. But he still does that. When you look at the second side, he still gets into the, it's all right, Ma, I'm only bleeding. I mean, there's some really cool lyrics in there, and they can be seen as, being political in their own right as well. But, I love It's All Over Now, Baby Blue as well. There's a great scene in Don't Look Back, the D.A. Pennebaker film, where they're in a hotel room and Dylan's playing, Donovan's there. And Donovan plays some song, and he's like a folk artist, and he's fine. He's like, I'll sing a song for you. That's what I'll do. I'll sing a song for you, something like that. And Dylan's like, okay, that's good. Then he plays It's All Over Now, Baby Blue. And you see Donovan just be like, holy shit, like, that guy just kicked my ass, right? So Gates of Eden's a great song. Mr. Tambourine, I don't mind him going long. The longest song on this record is Bob Dylan's 115th Dream, and man, he could do another 5 minutes of that. I love his sound. I love his voice. This is so natural. This is just like cool Dylan, exploring different, themes, exploring different sounds. And I think you get a little bit of everything in here. And I just think that every song is very, very strong. I don't get annoyed by anything. And you got love songs on here. I mean, they might be a little, you might not know exactly who he's talking about, but it's certainly some beautiful love songs like She Belongs to Me, Love Minus Zero, Over No Limit. But this is really strong stuff. And like I said, I'm interested I want to get back and listen more to Highway 61 and Blonde on Blonde. But I wouldn't be surprised if I walked away still convinced that this is my favorite Dylan album.
It doesn't surprise me with your taste, though, Matt, because like you said, it is a mix of early Dylan and mid Dylan. And I know that you're partial to both. So this does straddle the line pretty much perfectly. Now, we haven't talked about any of the instrumentation on this album at all, which I think is telling because it's very bare bones, in my opinion, for an album that's revolutionary of going electric. What instrumentation is there? There's an electric guitar, there's some bass, there's some drum, right? But I didn't catch much else besides that.
Harmonica.
Harmonica, it's a Dylan album,
right.
So there's harmonica. Yeah, I apologize, that's in there. But was I missing anything? Because I know in the later Dylan albums there was a lot of stuff going on, and I know for
piano.
a fact
Piano. There's keyboards and piano on here. Like what? Are you saying that's a knock against it? That there's not more interesting instruments that they're using?
I think it's just when we talked about the later Dylan albums, when I say later, I'm talking John Wesley Harding and Nashville Skyline. Excuse me. One of the first things I mentioned was the bass lines. And so nothing popped out at me musically on that. This is kind of like, it's not quite Dylan as spoken word poetry, like I feel like the early stuff is, or folk rock is in general. I think that's what holds it back for me a little bit. There's just nothing to me really revolutionary in terms of the sound of the album.
It's not as complex as those later albums.
I don't necessarily know if I need it to be complex. There's just nothing I really grasp onto as much. Like I said, the thing that really stood out to me was the quality of the songwriting, which was high. But that was sort of my takeaway. And I wonder if the songs were like the songs that came later, but with this arrangement, how I would feel about the album, because really the quality of the songwriting is what stood out to me on this. And his voice sounds a little bit better here as well.
Well, that kind of fits the progression of his career, right? Before it was just him and the guitar. Now it's like him and some backing musicians, and then maybe it gets a little more complex later on, or more complex melodies or instrumentation.
Well, it definitely gets heavier, and that's, I think, what I kept waiting for, and it just never happened. And so maybe it's a victim of the fact that I know what was to come, and I should really couch it in its own world, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But I still think there are some heavy. I think Outlaw Blues is a pretty heavy song.
Yeah,
I mean, that doesn't, and it's not like the entire record's like that, but that's a heavier song. And even I wouldn't say Bob Dylan's 115th Dream is heavy, but it's certainly, there's a lot of instruments going on there, and it's a very blues rock oriented song that's clearly electric, and it's clearly different than his previous records. So I think if you're going back in the time that this was released, looking at what he did before, it's a huge step forward. He goes even further into it later on, for sure, with the next two albums. But I still think all that stuff is there. I don't know. I think it's great. I don't think it needs to be complex. I think that Dylan doing music like this is the sweet spot for Dylan, right? This is where he's a really good folk artist, but what he does here with this, and I just personally, I love his voice. I love the way that this is produced. It's more of a raw type sound. There's not a whole, I mean, again, he did it in 2 days. This album was, let's do one take. And a lot of it was kind of just like figure it out on the spot, and let's just rock through this, Highway 61 also came out in the same year, so he was, he's busy doing, and he just did another album after this, so, but I think it's a really important album for, in Dylan's catalog, and it's certainly, if it's not his best, it's certainly, top 3 or 4 at least. I gotta say that's there.
So let me draw a comparison for you, Matt. If we talk about Dylan and the Beatles, right? This is kind of the mid 60s point for Dylan, in the same way that the Help, Revolver, Rubber Soul combination is for the Beatles, right? It's Bringing It Back Home, Highway 61 Revisited, and then Blonde on Blonde. So direct 3-song corollaries there. Even I think the years line up, if I remember correctly, for the most part. I feel that you're listening to this album in the same way that I listen to Help, like an album that just really stands out for you because you can see the artistic transition. And I went on and on about that, about Help, as I saw it. I guess I know you guys both said, well, it's really, I like what they did in Rubber Soul and Revolver better, which I totally get. And I feel like maybe that's how I feel about the Dylan albums. It's like, yeah, I can see a transition. It's certainly not a bad album, but it doesn't hold a candle to what I know is coming. And those are the things that, to me, are the stars forward, those two albums. So maybe that's a little bit of what's happening to me.
So you're saying this is like the Help of Bob Dylan?
It's the same exact spot in Dylan's career. I think it's even like Dylan had 4 albums and the Beatles had 4 albums before they...
Yeah.
It lines up pretty well when you look at it. And Help was 65, right? And this was 65.
Yeah, I would probably... and I certainly wouldn't... You can't fault anybody for saying that Blonde on Blonde or Highway 61 is their favorite or the best Dylan records. That's probably the more popular. That's there's nothing wrong with that. Absolutely, you're not going to get that argument. I would probably say in that comparison, it's pretty good overall. I would say that the departure, what Dylan does with this record is more of a departure from his earlier stuff than what the Beatles did with Help, and compared to their earlier stuff. Because this, I think there's
I don't know if I'd agree with that.
I think there's a bigger difference here. The folk stuff is just like. It was just, dude, for 4 albums, it was him and a guitar and a harmonica, essentially. And then he all of a sudden changes everything, brings in a full band, does rock stuff, ditches the lyrical content, kind of does the 180, even though you still have the folk stuff here. But he does a Dylan album. Stuff.
The second half of this album is still a Dylan album from the first 4. It's like the first half of the album that, to me, really... deviates to some degree.
No, that's true, but again, the lyrical content is totally like
I agree with that,
which is a big thing for Dylan fans in the early 60s.
It was for the Beatles though in Help. They wrote much more grown-up songs in Help than they wrote earlier.
But the Beatles in the early years were not known for their lyrics. That's not what drew people to the Beatles, and like Dylan.
Okay, I hear what you're saying.
They weren't political.
That was a bigger change for Dylan. The Beatles were changing, no doubt. This to me is a bigger change.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Gotcha.
And we also haven't touched on the fact that Mr. Tambourine Man's probably one of the most famous or recognizable Dylan songs.
Yeah.
I'm guessing.
Well, like most Bob Dylan for me, it's better
Yeah.
when somebody else does it than when he does it, which
The
is
Byrds-
a testament to his songwriting.
Yeah, the Byrds released that song a month after this album was released, and it went and it shot to number 1.
Yeah.
Yep.
You know what I mean? So like it was so it was clear that, and they only did like, I think they only did like 1 or 2 verses of it. You know what I mean? Like that's what they would do. They would cut it down because Dylan went a little long.
I may be no Tom Wilson, but cutting that down by about 2.5 minutes and adding jangle guitar with people that can sing, it's like, you know, later on, like, hey, we got this idea for you, Jimi Hendrix. We're going to cut this down. You know, basically, you're going to record this, but you're just going to plug in all the way up and sing it with a little bit more passion and a little bit more on tune. I think we got something here. So not to knock Dylan, but I always do find that, you know, he's an incredible songwriter in terms of what people can do with his stuff. You can't take that away from him.
Yeah.
Is it rare for? I thought it was such an outlier, you know, at least compared to previous Dylan albums, about having that kind of outtake in the 115th Dream. Is that typical of him, or is he? That seems more playful, or at least like raw, or almost like the Beach Boys when they had the hangout track at the end on that one album.
Yeah, that's not typical. That's just it's interesting. Like I thought I would read more about that as to what was going on, and it was just. No, something just made people start laughing, and that was it. And they decided, and that was. It sounds like it right away. They kick into the real song, but that was recorded the next day. So it was like they purposefully put that on there just as like a goof. But I don't know why. It sounds funny though. Makes you wish you were there because it sounds like they're having a lot of fun.
Yeah, it is. Fun.
But I'll say about Mr. Tambourine Man too that I always thought that was about about drugs. You know, Mr. Tambourine Man is a drug is a dealer. But Dylan always denied that and said that the inspiration from the song actually came from a large tambourine that was owned by the guitarist Bruce Langhorne. And he used to play this giant 4-inch deep tambourine that's actually called the Turkish frame drum. Wow. And Dylan took a liking to that, and that's what he wrote the song about. But
yes, just like all of his songs aren't political and stuff like
he didn't start taking LSD till 2 months after he wrote that song. So he was smoking a ton of weed.
It's really about a tambourine man.
Yeah.